Hello, hello. Welcome back, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. Welcome back, Technologist. Back recording episodes again. This is one of the most exciting things I love to do. Besides making TikToks, I love doing this. So welcome back, everybody. Spooky season is right around the corner. I just got a realization that the holidays are upon us and it is just like going so fast. So we're going to be into 2026 like super soon. So let me give you guys some updates on what is going on, okay? So, because it is cold as fuck in the Midwest, so I am like freezing and got all my sweatshirts, and I got some really cool gym gear that is like coming. So, that is like my favorite part. So, if you don't follow me on TikTok, I just recently documented 5 days of working 5 in a row, which was the most just excruciating thing. I would not recommend that to anybody. And I know somebody had commented that they work 7/12s. I don't know how you do it, my man, but I could not do that. So make sure you check that out on TikTok. The link is in the show notes. So make sure you follow me there. Make sure you follow on Instagram because I do repurpose a lot of educational stuff on Instagram. Even though I'm on Instagram just a few times a week, but I still repurpose a lot of stuff on there. So make sure you follow on TikTok, Instagram. Make sure you get on my email list too, so you can find out when I'm dropping new videos, dropping new podcast episodes, and dropping videos for the protocol of the week. So if you go into the show notes, sign up for my free 8-week checklist. It is a structured guide on how I feel you should learn while you are training in CT. So you can get on the email list, okay? And make sure you subscribe to my YouTube channel. I get some good resources on there, good videos, and you get the video portions of this podcast on there. Okay. So make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Share it with other technologists that need to hear this information and get educated. Okay. So get your asses in here. So let's get into today's episode. So today's episode is I'm going to be telling my origin story of how I became a CT tech. And I know I've said, probably made a couple episodes about that, but if this is your first time listening to me, hi, my name is Karina. I am a 23-year veteran of CT, and I educate all new CT technologists, even experienced ones, all the knowledge and the expertise I have so you can become a better, successful technologist, okay? So make sure you hit that subscribe button. So I'm going to be telling my origin story about how I became a confident, badass CT technologist / educator from a CT tech that was just completely lost when she started. Now, I remember my first day in CT, and it was one of the scariest things I've ever experienced. I worked at a small community hospital where there wasn't a lot of volume. We didn't do traumas. We didn't do, anything of that sort. It was just your basic bread and butter, your abdomen pelvises, your heads, your PE studies, occasionally a extremity here and there. So that was basically what we did. And they were having such a shortage and a hard time recruiting techs that they came to us in X-ray and said, hey, would you be interested in cross-training? We will pay you on the job and, to help us pick up some shifts. Sure, no problem. Well, when I started my first training day in CT, I had no idea what I fucking signed up for. Now, mind you, there was no courses at that time, and this is back in 2002. There were no courses at that time. There were no classes, no CT programs that really existed. Not even CT boot camp existed at that time, guys, okay? That didn't come around until a little bit after that. So that program did not exist, okay? Because I remember the guy who started that, it was like a 3-day boot camp, and he would host it like all over the country. And now, somebody else bought it out and it's part of like a bigger company now. But that didn't even exist. In the state of Nevada, where I grew up, none of these things existed. The only 3 things you had to learn, quote unquote, and to study for the test was your MIC CT registry review, the Mosby's CT registry review, and a cross-sectional anatomy book, which all 3 of those I used to study and I passed the registry. Okay. So I always recommend that in all my TikTok videos as well. There was no checklist. There was no structured program. There was no hospital-based program where I was to really give me the foundational skills on how I should be learning. I had to ask a lot of questions. I had to write things down. I had to learn by a lot of trial and error because there was a lot of exams where I clipped the head, clipped this, clipped that. didn't give enough contrast, outran the contrast. There was not great enhancement, missed IVs. So it was a lot of trial and error as I started. Okay. And I remember just scanning like this really sick patient, PE study, saddle PE. And I was just absolutely terrified because I had no idea what it actually looked like. And calling the radiologist and saying, hey, this exam doesn't look right. And just having everybody come in there and rush the patient out of CT and back to the ER. Now, what I did appreciate is some of the radiologists that we worked with at that hospital, if you went into the reading room, they would actually teach you something. I had one radiologist that he would push back a lot on CT exams. I remember one night with my old CT partner, they had ordered, I want to say like 10 or 11 exams because this kid fell off of his bicycle. It wasn't a motorized bike. It was because those really didn't exist at that time. It wasn't like a motorcycle. It was just a bicycle and he was wearing a helmet. And they wanted to order like an entire pan scan on this kid. And so when we told the radiologist all the orders, man, I can't tell you how we contained ourselves because he was screaming over that phone. And he went ahead and talked to those doctors and all those CTs got canceled. They just ordered a couple x-rays of the kid. So they were very conscientious when it came to dose and conscientious on the amount of scans that we do, which that doesn't fucking apply now because physicians just scan everybody and think, yes, well, if they came in with this or they possibly could have this, well, if I don't do this, then what if they do? And then I get sued, which all those reasons are valid. But there's also criteria and appropriate like guidelines that you can use to kind of rule out what you're looking for on the patient. But it's up to their discretion if they want to use it. So meanwhile, I remember I took a lot of notes. I wrote down protocols. I wrote down injection protocols, flow rates, you name it. And I remember back in 2006, I was like, okay, I think I might be ready to take the registry. I've been in CT for about 3 or 4 years. Why don't I just go ahead and do it, right? So I went ahead and I failed miserably because I didn't take that test seriously. I didn't study appropriately. And I just thought, oh, well, I got 3-4 years under my belt. I know exactly what I'm doing. This is what's going to be on the registry. Wrong. How fucking wrong I was because I needed to actually study those books. I actually needed to review the material. I actually needed to know my physics. I needed to know all those things and my technical factors because those are things that are important that you need to know on the registry. Anybody that tells you the registry is easier than X-ray is bullshitting because that's an advanced level exam and it's 10 times harder. Okay, well, Karina, how do you know that? Because I sat on the CT committee for ARRT for 2 years, helping improve that test. Okay, so I can tell you it's 10 times harder. Now, here's one thing that I want you to think about. Okay, if you feel like you're failing because you're training, you're new, you're not familiar, you're not. Okay, the reason why I say you're not is because you never got like a clear outline system, like structured training, because a lot of places don't have time to do that. Okay. So the hospital I worked at, that didn't exist. So basically is you had to ask, and I'm not saying that all the techs that I worked with were good because some of them weren't. Okay. But you sucked all the knowledge out of all of them, which I took every little bit of advice and every little piece of education, training, whatever it was, and I wrote it down so I can keep it. And then, and then as far as how I was scanning patients, I would make it my own style. And that is the whole purpose of that. So I went to a bigger hospital after being there because management kind of changed. The organization was changing. They were getting bought out by somebody else. And so a bigger hospital had offered me way more money than what the manager came back with. Because I told him, I said, hey, I'm going to another hospital system. What can you do for me? And basically they lowballed me. And I said, well, I'm making, $5 more. So I'm going to go over there. So I ended up following my supervisor and my other, and the other technologist I worked with, who was my CT partner for 12 years. And I was working second shift. So it was a bigger hospital. There was more demand, more acuity, more exams, and I really got more training. And some of the other techs that I worked with there were really good. And so I was able to learn even more. So when I switched, I had already been in CT about 5 years. So I was still working PM shift. I was working weekends. I was taking on call. So of course, you got to pay your dues in CT. I know we would all love a day shift, but you got to pay your dues. So as time kind of went on, my supervisor suddenly ended up leaving. So they had approached me and said, hey, would you be interested in being like a interim as a CT supervisor? I was like, I don't know nothing about managing CT. Why would I want to do that? And they said, listen, it's on an interim basis. You have the knowledge, you have the skill. We can send you to leadership courses. Would you do it? I said, okay, sure. Sometimes in life, you have to take, like when a door opens, you can always explore that door and it just gives you more experience on your resume, right? So I said, okay, no problem. So I did the interim thing for probably about 6 months before they hired somebody. And then they hired somebody, but that person ended up not working out because there were some other issues and things like that. So they came back to me and said, hey, would you do this on a permanent basis? And you can train everybody, you can decide who you want and this and that, and we can send you to more leadership courses if you want. So I said, okay. So for 8 years, I did that where I went ahead and I spent almost 10 years at that hospital that I worked at. So, and I was managing CT. At that time, I had gotten married. I had a child because I had a stepdaughter. So, and then I had a child, and come to find out, my daughter had a lot of medical complexities due to a rare genetic disorder. And so I really had to step away from my role as a supervisor to kind of just be a technologist again. So that's when I went ahead and started exploring to work at the VA. I could tell you, working at the VA was one of the best times in my career. So how I managed to get there was, of course, I had a little help from my ex-husband because he's retired military. And my first assignment, because I was going to work at the new VA hospital in Las Vegas. So if anybody is listening, I know there was a gentleman that had commented on one of my TikTok videos that knows the techs that I work with over there. So, but that hospital hadn't even been built yet. They were in the process of building it. So they said, okay, well, we're going to send you out to Nellis Air Force Base. I had never been out to the Air Force Base in Vegas at all. And I said, okay, which is clear across town. Okay. It is like on the northeast side of town, like, just way out there. Okay. So I said, okay. So I remember my first experience working there. I'm telling you, if you guys ever get the opportunity to work with the military, and just hear me out for a second, take yourself out of the mix on what the fuck is going on right now. Okay. Because we know the world is a shit show. Okay. This was back in 2012. It was the best time in my career. I learned so much from them. I even precepted their students when we did IV sticks, things like that. I trained most of the techs that were there. They passed their registry that would cross-train for 8 weeks because they had to be dual modality. They run their X-ray programs similar to ours. Theirs is structured a little bit different, but they are JCERT accredited. So it was one of the best times. I learned so much from those technologists. They learned so much from me, and there are some of them I still keep in contact to with this day. So it was one of the best times in my career because you get to expand your knowledge and you get to expand your learning curve and see how others do it. Okay. So I can say that it was one of the best things that I've ever done for my career. Now, how I kind of migrated into, education and things like that. So one of my clinical instructors in X-ray school, he had always told me, he goes, you should think about teaching. You're very good at training. You should think about teaching. And I said, oh, well, I don't know how I would do that. And he goes, no, you should think about teaching. And he said this to me for years. And I just continued to do more staff jobs. When I came to the Midwest, I did take a management position, but that management position really didn't work out because when somebody else is intimidated with your talent and they feel threatened, then they go ahead and cut your job. And that's exactly what happened. But I could tell you, I ran that entire department and try to put everything back together. But when somebody who's intimidated with my experience, my knowledge, and my expertise, they're going to cut that down really fast. Which it didn't hurt me in the end because I just became better. And I went to what I know best is to be a technologist and excel in that. So When COVID hit, well, let me back up. Before COVID hit, I was in the process of going through a really just difficult divorce with my children's father. And I had had a second child in the process as well. Okay. So it was probably one of the lowest, darkest times of my life where I was dealing with not only having all three of my daughters and then trying to navigate how I'm going to operate life with being divorced. Okay. So COVID hit. And of course, I'm working and being on the front lines, getting sick, doing that, taking care of children. They were doing remote learning and all those things, right? Well, I had this idea and I kept listening to what my clinical instructor was saying and saying, hey, why don't you teach? So I created a just, crash course. It was like my first time teaching, and I signed on with Rad CEU providers to provide like a CT 101 that gives you like 4 CEs, which I will link that in the show notes as well. And just taught some of, from like just a crash course from A to Z on things that you would need to know in CT as far as contrast, the CT patient, window level, window width, all those things. And I went ahead and taught it. And so I said, I can actually create content and I can create things on my own and teach my own courses. So of course I have done that where I have put together just a 3-course program for CT technologists who are new, they're starting their training, they're during their training, so they know the A through Z as far as the basics of CT. So I went a little bit further and said, hey, let me create some TikTok content. Let me put a YouTube channel, and started educating and teaching technologists that way. Plus, I decided to make a private 10 episode private audio series, so that you get a snapshot of the points of what I think you should be learning and how you should be navigating your training, which also will be linked in the show notes. Okay. So all these pieces is how really I became a successful technologist, a badass educator, and your CT guru on just expanding my knowledge. Number one, sharing that knowledge with you and not gatekeeping, because we don't gatekeep around here. Okay. So that is kind of my origin story on how I kind of navigated into where I am today. And I had this idea of this podcast I've had this idea for this podcast since 2006. Here we are. So yes, because I've been listening to podcasts that long. Okay. And at that time, a podcast like this did not exist. And now you find many radiology podcasts out there, which all those folks that do those podcasts, they are my mutuals on social media, and I absolutely love every single one of them. Okay. So that is kind of the origin story on how I went from being a lost CT technologist, have no idea and had no idea what I signed up for, to this educator, badass mama of 3, and just an awesome CT technologist that I am, because I give kudos to myself because I've really invested myself in a lot of things that I do. And it does show, considering that I've helped people. I've trained a lot of techs in my day, and I've helped most of them pass the registry and give them the right tools and the right direction on how to do it. Now, sometimes what works for me may not work for you, but I am just here to guide you and give you some recommendations and give you some suggestions to take. You can take them if you don't, and you can make it your own. Okay. Now, what I do want to stress in this episode, okay, you're not failing. You just never got some structure or some training. Okay. And those are the pieces that I'm really honing in on when it comes to making courses and making sure that you understand that. Okay. Now, my 8-week checklist lays out what I think you should be focusing in your CT training. It's like a roadmap that I wish I would have had, because I think as a brand new person, even if you're a traveler and you're going to a brand new site, this is something that is a guide that I feel that you should follow, because it'll guide you in the right direction on how to be successful at that site, how to be successful in your training. Okay. So I wish I would have had something like this, and that's why I've created it for you. So make sure you download that checklist right now, because it's the roadmap to get you from overwhelm into structure when it comes to your CT training. So that is everything I have for this episode this week. So make sure you check out the show notes for everything that I talked about. as far as following on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube channel. Subscribe to the podcast, the 8-week checklist, and make sure that you like, share, comment. Make sure you share it with somebody that really can use this as value, because I put a lot of value into these podcast episodes so that you can continue gaining knowledge and becoming the most successful CT technologist out there. So thank you so much for joining me on this episode, and I will catch you guys in the next episode.